recording so that we can post this on our sites later for people who weren't able to join us today. Just for some background on the three of us, we all met several years ago at NYU's creative writing program. And so it's just kind of come full circle that the timelines have converged again many years later. And the three of us each have our debut novel came out earlier this year. So that was kind of an exciting coincidence. So it's nice to be reunited with these two lovely writers. We're going to read a little bit from each of our books. We'll drop bios in the chat so you can see a little bit more about each of us as we're reading. And then we're going to start a discussion around the common themes that show up in the books that we've written. And just to give you a preview of what those are, we see a lot of similarities around the topic of home and what home means and what it's like when your home is threatened and how that changes your perspective. Also around survival, when your livelihood or your community is threatened, how you respond and how that affects us emotionally. And then also language. There's a lot in each of these books about how things are presented, languages that are used. Translation is a factor in Mary's book. So we're going to just dig into these themes and have a discussion. You are welcome to, if you have a question, you're welcome to raise your hand in Zoom or throw something in the chat, and I will do my best to moderate it. I think that this may be like, this is my Zoom moderator challenge moment. Can I like manage all of the inputs? So I will do my best to catch everybody's questions. And then we will wrap up around 6:45 or 6:50 or so. So we're going to read, we decided to read in chronological order for no real reason other than it seemed like it might be kind of fun to watch this progression through these different periods, starting with the Middle Ages and leading up to present day. So I am going to hand it over to first Mary McMyne is going to read from her book, The Book of Gothel. And then I'm going to read from my book, The Grand Promise. And then Cleyvis is going to read from her book, Neruda On the Park. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Mary McMyne to read to you from her lovely book.
Hello, everyone. It is wonderful to be here. Let me put my bio. Whoa. Okay, that's my bio in the chat. So my book, The Book of Gothel, if you say it the German way, or Gothel if you go with the American way, is basically the tale of the medieval midwife who would become known as the witch from Rapunzel. The novel has a documented conceit in that there's a prologue where an American academic discovers this manuscript. She gets called to Germany to check it out. And she's asked to translate it. And so after you read the prologue, you turn the page and it is the first page of the manuscript, ostensibly translated from Middle High German. So I'm just gonna start at the beginning and read for a bit until I get to a stopping point here. Declaration. This is a true account of my life. Mother Gothel, they call me. I have become known by the name of this tower, a vine-covered spire stretching into the trees, cobbled together from stone. I have become known for the child I stole, little girl, not pretty, Rapunzel. I named her for her mother's favorite herb. My garden is legendary, row after row of hellebore and hemlock, yarrow and bloodwort. I have read many a speculum on the natural properties of plants and stones, and I know them all by heart. I know what to do with belladonna, with lungwort and cinquefoil. I learned the healing arts from a wise woman, the spinning of tales from my mother. I learned nothing from my father, a no-name fisherman. My mother was a midwife. I learned that from her too. Women come to me from all over to hear my stories, to make use of my knowledge of plants. Traipsing in their boots and lonely skirts through the world they come, one by one, with their secret sorrows. Over the hill, across the hill, over the river, across the hills, to the wise woman they hope can heal their ails. After I give them what they seek and take my fee, I spin my stories. sifting through my memories, polishing the facts of my life until they shine like stones. Sometimes they bring my stories back to me, changed by retelling. In this book, under lock and key, I will set down the truth. In this, the 78th year of my earthly course, I write my story, a faithful account of my life, heretical though it may be, a chronicle of facts that have since been altered to correct the lies being repeated as truth. This will be my book of deeds, written from the famous Tower of Bothwell, where a high wall encloses the flora and herbs. Cleyvis, daughter of Heta, the year of our Lord, 1219. Chapter 1. What a boon it is to have a mother who loves you. A mother who comes to life when you walk into the room, who tells stories at bedtime, who teaches you the names of plants that go wild in the wood. But it is possible for a mother to love too much, for love to take over her heart like a weed does a garden, to spread its roots and proliferate until nothing else grows. My mother was watchful in the extreme. She suffered 3 stillbirths before I was born, and she didn't want to lose me. She tied a keeping string around my wrist when we went to market, and she never let me roam. There were dangers for me in the market, no doubt. I was born with eyes the color of ravens, no color, no light in my irises, and by the time I was 5, I suffered strange fainting spells that made others fear I was possessed. As if that wasn't enough, when I was old enough to attend births with my mother, rumors spread about my unnatural skill with midwifery. Long before I became her apprentice, I could pinpoint the exact moment when a baby was ready to be born. To keep me close, my mother told me that Kinderfresser haunted the market, a she-demon who lured children to the city to drink their blood. Mother said she was a shapeshifter who took the forms of people children knew to trick them into going away with her. This was before the bishop built the city wall, when travelers still passed freely, selling charms to ward off fevers, arguing about the ills of the church. The market square was bustling then. You could find men and women in strange robes with skin of every color, selling ivory bangles and gowns made of silk. Mother allowed me to admire their wares, holding my hand tightly. Stay close, she said, her eyes searching the stars. Don't let the Kinderfresser snatch you away. The bishop built the wall when I was 10 to protect the city from the mist that blew off the forest. The priest called it an unholy fog that carried evil and disease. After the wall was built, only holy men and peddlers were allowed to pass through the city gate. Monks on pilgrimage, traders of linen and silk, merchants with ox carts full of dried fish. Even though the town was enclosed, Mother still wouldn't let me wander without her, especially around the new moon when my spells most often plagued me. Whenever I saw children running errands or playing knucklebones behind the minster, an uneasy bitterness filled me. Not long after the wall was built, the tailor's son Mateus knocked on our door, dark hair shining in the sun, his eyes flashing with merriment. I brought arrows, he said. Can you come out to the grove and teach me to shoot? Our mothers had become friends due to my mother's constant needs for scraps of cloth. She made poppets to sell during the cold season, and the 2 women had spent many an afternoon sorting scraps and gossiping at the sailor's shop as we played. The week before, Mateus and I had found an orange kitten. Father would have drowned him in a sack, but Mateus wanted to give him milk. As we sneaked the kitten upstairs to his room, I had racked my brain for something to offer him so we could play again. Mother had taught me everything she knew about how to use a bow. Shooting was one of the few things I was good at. Please, I begged my mother. She looked at me tight-lipped and shook her head. Mother, I said, I need a friend. She blinked, sympathetic. What if you have a spell? We'll take the back street. The moon is almost full. Mother took a deep breath, emotions roaring on her face. All right, she sighed finally. Let me tie back your hair. I yelped with joy, though I hated the way she pulled my curls, which in general refused to be tamed and which I had inherited from her. Thank you, I said when she was finished, grabbing my quiver and bow and my favorite poppet. 10 was an odd age for me. I could shoot as well as a grown man, but had yet to give up childish things. I still brought the poppet called Boottle that Mother made for me everywhere. A poppet with black hair just like mine, tied back with ribbons. She wore a dress of linen scraps dyed my favorite color, madder red. Her eyes were two shining black beads. I was a quizzical child, a show-me child, a wild thing who had to be dragged to mass, but I saw a sort of magic in my mother's pocket monkey. Nothing unnatural, mind you, the sort of thing everyone does, like set out food for the fates or choose a wedding date for good luck. The time she took choosing the right scraps, the words she murmured as she sewed, made that doll alive to me. On our way out, Mother reminded me to watch for the kinderpresser. Amber eyes, no matter what shape she takes, remember, she lowered her voice. You'll want to warn that boy about your spells. I nodded, cheeks flushing with shame, though Mateus was too polite to ask what my mother had said under her breath. We hurried toward the North Gate, past the docks and the other fishermen's huts. I pulled my hood over my head so the sun wouldn't bother my eyes. They were sensitive in addition to being as black as night. Bright light made my head ache. The leaves of the linden trees were turning yellow and beginning to fall to the ground. As we stepped into the grove, ravens scattered. The grove was full of beasts the carpenters had trapped when the wall was built. It was common to see a family of hares hopping beneath the lindens. Mateus showed me the straw-stuffed bird atop a pole that everyone used for archery practice. I sat Doodle at the base of a tree trunk, reaching down to straighten her coat. My heart soared as I reached for my bow. Here I was, finally, outside the hut without Mother. I felt normal, almost. I felt free. Did you hear about the Queen? Mateus asked, pulling his bow back to let the arrow fly. We went wild, missing the trunk to stray into the sunny clearing. No, I called, squinting and shading my eyes as I watched him go after it. Even with the shadow of my hand looking directly at the sunlight hurt, he reappeared with the arrow. King Frederick banished her. How do you know? A courtier told my father while he was getting fitted. Why would the king banish his wife? Mateus shrugged as he handed me the arrow. The man said she asked too many guests into her garden. I forced myself to concentrate on my shot. When the arrow pierced the trunk, Mateus sucked in his breath. At first, I thought he was reacting to my aim. Then I saw he was looking at the tree where Rebekah sat. A giant raven with bright black hackles was bent over her. I charged at the bird. Shoo, get away from her. The bird ignored me until I was right beside it, and it looked up at me with amber eyes. Crake, it said, shaking its head as it dropped. I can't do a raven, I'm sorry. As it dropped Doodle on the ground. It kept something in its beak, something glittering and black, which flashed as it took off. On the left side of Doodle's face, the thread was loose. The wool had come out. The raven had plucked out her eye. Go ahead. I think Rebecca's going to go next, right?
Yeah, thank you, Mary. And I'm so glad that you included the declaration in there because it tees up the framework of the, that this is a story that she has written, her biography. So I hope we can talk about that a little bit more later too. So I'm Rebekah Anderson. I'm going to drop my bio in the chat, and I'm going to be reading from my novel, The Grand Promise, which is a fictionalized account of the communities that were impacted by the construction of the Grand Coulee Dam, which was built as a public works project that was funded by President Roosevelt, back in the 1930s. And at the time, it was the largest hydroelectric project ever built. And it was built on the Columbia River in the western United States. And thousands of acres of land and dozens of towns were flooded when the dam backed up in the reservoir in the river. So this is from early in the book, where they're learning that this project is the town of Kettle Rapids, which is a fictionalized place, learns that this project is happening. So this is November 1935. A well-dressed man named Stark spoke up. Town has not been in its prime. Oh, you know what? I'm a page early. Still November 1935. In the front of the hall, the old oak table that had been there for 50 years seemed uncomfortably empty. Large posters placed against the wall begged explanation. Carter leaned against the wood paneling of the back wall, trying not to look at May. He could feel her location in a red flush on that side of his face. He stole a look at her, and she caught his eye and looked quickly away, her face unyielding. The room went silent as a group of strangers shuffled into the doorway, one man in a modest brown tweed suit holding the door open for the rest of them as he tried not to drop the dog-eared sheaf of papers under his arm. The air filled with murmurs as the men made their way to the front of the hall. Two men took seats behind the oak table. By their clothes, one was clearly better paid than any of the others. The rest of their cadre pressed into the front of the crowd. The better-dressed man surveyed the room as he strode to the table. Carter wasn't sure he cared what these men had to say. He looked at May and she caught his gaze again, frowning. Carter felt a panic in his chest. The room felt suddenly overbearingly hot and crowded. He focused his attention on the large oak table up front and noticed name placards on the table for the first time. Frank Banks from the Bureau of Reclamation and a man named M.J. Starks from the development company. Before the men started speaking, Ozzy was on his feet. "What were your men doing surveying the shore by my ferry last month?" A chorus of voices rose up behind Ozzy, people wanting to know the answer themselves. "When are you building the dam?" someone shouted from the crowd. Mr. Banks waved his hands in front of him, indicating they should simmer down. "Yes, federal funding is secured to start construction on a dam that will provide irrigation to 10,000 square miles of farmland east of the Cascades." He gestured to one of the posters with a map of the area in question. "You know it around here as the pumping plan your local commission has been advocating for. Power sales will pay back the construction costs in less than 50 years. Where? Here? 50 years? What about the power company's permit for a dam here at the rapids?" Mr. Banks continued. "We've selected a location 100 miles south of here with a natural wall that will ease the construction and allow us to back the river up for several miles. There won't be any rapids after that." A murmur of outrage rippled the crowd. "How far?" Men at the table looked at each other. "How far will the river back up?" Clearly, this was what they'd come to town to explain. "Past the Canadian border," Mr. Banks said. Carter heard gasps around him. Kettle Rapids was more than 50 miles downstream from the border. "The Columbia will back up for several hundred miles, creating a natural reservoir where the water can be stored," Mr. Banks explained. "Unfortunately, this will mean the water levels in the smaller rivers along the Columbia, such as the Kettle River here, will rise significantly." "You're flooding us? You're flooding the town?" "State for your losses," Mr. Banks said hesitantly. "The federal government will provide additional funds to purchase your property from you at a fair market price. Those who own buildings in the anticipated flood zone will be able to move them to higher ground, and the funds should allow you to purchase land elsewhere." The well-dressed man named Stark spoke up. "This town has not been in its prime for decades now, ladies and gentlemen. I dare say you don't have much to lose by moving up the hill a ways. If anything, the town has a better chance of reliving some of its heyday once the irrigation systems are complete and the railroad tracks are laid." A man from the crowd spoke, and even though Carter couldn't see his face, he recognized the voice immediately as his wife's father, Boone Hoffman, who owned a still profitable construction company in town. Carter shrank deeper against the wall, his eyes following the sound of his father-in-law's voice. Right now, the town going away forever sounded like a relief. "Will there be roadwork for experienced contractors?" Starks nodded to Boone in what looked to Carter like feigned sympathy. Starks rose from the table and walked around to the front. Resting his hip against its surface, he leaned forward, opening his hands as though presenting the finale of a magic trick. "You have to think long term," he addressed the crowd as if he trained his voice for this kind of audience. "This town, this state, and this country are in a situation right now. We all have to think of the long term." Carter could hear men around him grumbling. May looked up at her father while he spoke. Carter's face burned and he tried to focus on what was being said, but he couldn't stop staring at her. This was exactly why he shouldn't have come. Didn't his father know that? "This is an imperfect moment," Mr. Starks said. "There are sacrifices to be made, and yet there are also great rewards to be had. Many of you have struggled for some time. Your crops suffered from lack of water. Your businesses suffered from lack of customers. The jobs you once counted on are gone. Years ago, this was a town of opportunity with gold and coal and a rail line to ship it out. Now many have already left. Shopkeepers closed their doors. The Grand Hotel that was once a monument to this town's momentum is a museum of its finer past. This moment is imperfect because you will have to choose. Do you cling to the past and the memories of what was, or do you move forward into the unknown?" Stark stood and looked out the window into the distance. "Last year, I had the opportunity to attend the World's Fair in faraway Chicago. The day I went, snow dusted the ground, not unlike how it looks outside today. The park and Lake Michigan were gray and blue, the colors of concrete and steel. This entire fair was called Century of Progress, and as I approached the main gate, the archway spanning above my head said in bold letters, "Science finds, industry applies, man adapts." I stopped. He arced his hand in front of him like he was running it over the sign. "Science finds, industry applies, man adapts." I had to think about that before I entered the Century of Progress. Was I the kind of man who could adapt? He looked around the quiet room. In the decade or so that engineers and policymakers have been theorizing about how to make better use of the many rivers in this area, one thing has been resoundingly consistent. No one can agree on one clear answer. Now, you may think this new proposal means the death of your town. I'm not saying I disagree. For certain, you will have to leave some things behind, your property, your memories, the shape and proportion of the way it once was. But man adapts. You will either move or be taken by the river. He took his seat again behind the table and glanced at a sheet of paper. The room was held in a reverent silence, and Carter marveled at the hold this man's speech had on them. "I will need thousands of men to help me build this dam," Starks continued. "I will need vendors to supply with materials to build it. There will be roads and bridges to build, railroad tracks to lay. I will need business owners to provide food, supplies, and entertainment for my workers. Our president plans to be generous with what he offers to compensate you for your land. And Mr. Banks is correct. There is good land not far from here where you can rebuild your town. Yes, this is all good and useful. What I'm offering you is so much more than a new place for an old existence." When President Roosevelt came to visit the site for our new dam, he said it was the best use of everything for all. The future is ours to define, and yours may very well sit 100 miles downriver from here. Only you can decide. A low grumble ran through the room. Mr. Banks from the Bureau of Reclamation looked embarrassed, but Carter was riveted. He hadn't thought of it quite like that. He looked at May, wondering if she heard the same thing he did about the possibility of a fresh start. He remembered lying in bed with her before the house was built, describing the kitchen to her, her cheek resting on his shoulder as she looked up at him with those same wide green eyes. Now she did not return his gaze. "Either way, the decision has been made and our crews will start blasting," Starks went on. "Those in the floodplain will receive a letter from the federal government indicating when they are to move and the purchase price the government is willing to pay. The president is thinking long-term. The farmers of this region are thinking long-term." Stark spread his hands wide to emphasize his point. "There's no quick fix here, ladies and gentlemen." Ozzie Price leapt to his feet, startling Carter, even though he'd been expecting an outburst from his father. Ozzie's round body was trembling, and he gripped his hat firmly in front of him. "Screw your long-term. Sure, I care about farmers, but I don't make my living from my farm anymore, and I'm already losing business from the new bridge." Carter's face burned again. Another man jumped up. "He's saying there will be jobs, Price. Lots of us need the work." Several voices rose up in support. Ozzie looked around the room, red-faced and angry. "I own a respectable ferry business, a family business. I supported you pumpers. I opposed the gravity plan for you. I wrote letters for you and donated money to your commission. Now you want me to move my business? How can I do business on the river if you move the goddamn river?" "Sir, please be calm." Mr. Banks looked like he was still getting used to the fury these meetings could cause. "I won't let you do it," Ozzie said. "I'll write to the governor. I'll write to the paper. What about the rest of us who need the money they're offering, Price? You're not the only one with a dog in this fight." "I'm with Price," Ozzie's friend Jackson, who owned the local gas station, stood in solidarity. "I can't afford to dig up my tanks or buy new ones. I'll have to shut down. Is that progress?" Mr. Banks rapped a gavel sharply on the table, but no one paid him any attention. The shouters drowned each other out. Two men shoved and grappled each other, their shoes squealing on the wood floor as the crowd and company men pulled them apart. Carter knew the kind of man his father was. Once he started on a rampage, it was impossible to stop him until all the steam blew itself out. Mr. Banks tried to calm the crowd, but Ozzie was already on his feet and headed toward the door. "To hell with your long-term," he shouted over his shoulder. "To hell with all of you." Shouts of agreement followed him as men from the town walked out of the meeting before it had officially ended. As Ozzie passed Carter, his face a burning red, he spat out, "Nice of you to show your face, son." And I will hand it to Cleyvis.
That was such a great reading. I loved it. Okay, so I put my bio in the chat. And Rebekah, I don't think yours paste it into the chat. I think maybe you sent it to one individual person. Sometimes that happens, or maybe I just can't see it. I don't know why. But hi, everybody. So good to be here. I'm so happy to be Zooming with all of you. I'm going to read to you from my debut, Neruda on the Park. And this is a story that takes place in modern times. And it is about an immigrant community in a fictional neighborhood in New York City. And it's about what happens when gentrification arrives. The story is told from two perspectives. A mother, Eusebia, who decides very quickly she wants to resist the changes to her community. And then her daughter, Luz, who is, an upwardly mobile, college-educated lawyer and a lawyer. And it's about how the two of them kind of deal with the change in very different ways. So I'm going to read to you a little bit from the beginning of the book, where the mother Eusebia is talking to her best friends about a plan she has concocted to dissuade strangers from moving to their neighborhood. And all you have to know is that they've walked up the stairs to a neighborhood that's next door to where the new building is going to be built. Okay. Eusebia willed herself to stop the sensation of movement, of falling and twirling through the air in opposite directions at once, a nauseous feeling. Usually, this was the moment that forced her to close her eyes and seek lower ground. Not today. On weak knees, she walked to where the women stood and inhaled deeply as she leaned over. Beneath them, it was as if a bomb had exploded. Bricks, pipes, concrete, refrigerators, stoves, even farther away, discarded toys, a doll with matted hair, a blue truck missing a wheel. She was puzzled at the sharpness of her vision. How could they have done all of that in 3 days? How could they possibly have gotten that done so fast? One of her friends said. They discarded that old building to make room for what? Her friends asked. Eusebia never imagined there would be this much space. I have an idea on how to stop all of this from happening, she said. The tongues looked at her curiously. What if we just scare everyone into thinking this neighborhood is really bad, she said. The women smiled, thinking it a joke, brilliant in its simplicity. How would we do that? They asked. Eusebia could clearly see the envoy's thought that it would be too easy to work. Eusebia then spoke in a confident way, as if this conversation had already happened. She explained she meant recruiting their neighbors who would act out crimes throughout the neighborhood with other volunteers who would be the victims of these crimes. You mean fake crimes? They asked. No, not fake, real. Who'd be crazy enough to move to a neighborhood amid a crime spree? What kind of crimes? They asked. Eusebia was quiet. She had come up with a list, but she knew if they participated, helped formulate it, they'd be in. What would scare you? She asked. What would be bad enough? This is the kind of idea that can destroy a community, they said. That can save it, she corrected. The women stared at her worried. They understood she was serious. She'd moved too fast. Eusebia extended her arm around the neighborhood, lovingly sweeping all they could see. Over by their side of the park, Raul's shipping place, the cleaners owned by the Chinitos born in the Dominican Republic, the liquor store, the dentist. She wrapped her arm around herself, signaling what they couldn't see, the smell of water boiling for raw vegetables, of meat sizzling in pans, laundry being folded, children being kissed, phone calls back home to people who needed help, who would be lost without the support of those who had traveled here. We can just come up with a list of things people are scared of, she said. The women exchanged looks. They spoke to each other with the simple speed of a blink, but now Eusebia was in on it, an eavesdropper. Questions floated among all four of them. Could it work? Was it worth trying? What else as an alternative? It was true. Fear would work. Fear always worked. She turned her body away from them to the park. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. Her daughter or her husband must be worried, but she'd care for them later. Now she turned her attention to the destruction beneath them. It tugged at something in the women, but Eusebia was the only one who called out that dead boy's name. She had a strange feeling of being anchored to the tarmac on the roof for a long time. It made sense when the blinding sky turned into a black sky and the sun was replaced by a yellow pockmarked moon. There was complete stillness and silence in the work site. The men had gone for the day. If we don't stop it, Eusebia said, it will not be stopped. This is the kind of idea that might destroy, they said again. Eusebia followed their gaze around Natera Park as they took in the yellow light that pulsed softly from the windows of the brownstones that flanked the park, with halos of rainbows bordering the light. There was the sound of the television, of music, of laughter, the natural noises of a neighborhood that shut the hostility outside what they had made here. Somewhere far away, a baby cried, a newborn, by the sound of the urgency in its voice, as if underlining what was truly at stake. It wasn't just about them. And so, impossibly, her friends agreed to go along. Thank you. That's it.
That's great. And I'm so glad you read a scene that had the tongues in it, because I think that is a really interesting part of the story, and that we can also talk about later in Q&A. So we're going to open up the conversation now. I think I'm going to change the view back to be able to see non-video participants. So if you do have a question, feel free to throw something in the chat or raise your hand, and we can unmute you if you want to talk to us directly. Otherwise, we will just chat amongst ourselves, and feel free to chime in.
So that was amazing to hear, Cleyvis. Thank you. And Rebekah, I love the like the group scene and everything that's happening. Like it's such a conflict ridden, but people are being so restrained. You know, like they're trying not to let things get out of hand. So I was really interested in the way that you've chosen to like write a novel around this central conflict of the struggle between home and this idea of progress, because it seems to be a really strong theme and a really important idea in your novel. So I was wondering what inspired you to choose that particular subject matter.
Idea for the book it's loosely based on family history. My family homesteaded in that area. They were gone before the dam was built, but I went on a road trip with my mom out to where my grandfather grew up. And so we saw where the family homestead was, and when we were looking at where the town was, and she explained to me that the town didn't exist anymore because it was underneath the river. And I was like, what? You know, she was like, yeah, when the Grand Coulee Dam was built, it backed up all this way. And so now the town is actually under the reservoir. So I did some research about it. And I mean, the history is, the conflict is like embedded in that history. People have been fighting over irrigation in this area since for 100 years at this point. And so it was really inherent in that history, but I did take it a step further because I needed a central conflict. And I think that's one of the challenges of writing historical fiction, is that you're kind of starting, you may have experienced some of this too, you're kind of starting from a high concept incident that happened, and then you have to try to figure out how to personalize it. Like, so who are the people who are going to be the voices of the story, so that it's not, otherwise it's a nonfiction book, right? So I built that, sent that conflict into the relationship of father and son, where, you know, they are sort of emblematic of the different sides of this argument, that one of them sees the advantages of this development project and ends up going to work on it. Spoiler alert, it happens early on, so it doesn't spoil everything. And then the father is really opposed to it and very a vocal activist against the project, because he stands to lose his business and his home and all of the things that he has built over his lifetime. So I chose to make that the central conflict, to kind of carry that into the personal realm from like the sort of historical perspective of it being the community conflict. And I think something that's interesting about there's a real similarity with Cleyvis's book as well. So I wanted to hear Cleyvis's thoughts on this too, that it has that kind of a similar structure of it's a community, a development project is throwing a wrinkle into the mix, and there are opposing sides, and it ends up playing out between in a family. So it has this kind of shared theme of home versus progress, and how that shows up in personal relationships. And so I'm curious what how that worked for Cleyvis.
Thanks. It's so fascinating too to think about how complicated it is to create tension out of history. So I have like such deep respect for both of you, because I feel like, Mary, you took your inspiration from folklore, and I can't wait for you to like talk about that. But I also feel like, Rebekah, with your story, I think, it's so interesting because in earlier versions of my book, like the word progress was like all over it, like people be like, this is the way we go forward as a community. And so, what I ended up doing was stripping away that kind of direct language and making the tension between the mother and the daughter really a lot of the tensions that play out, I think, in marginalized communities when development comes in. And when you think about who benefits from gentrification, which is kind of the central tension in my book, it's usually like upperly mobile and, white people largely that benefit from, at least the entry point into marginalized communities that are being developed. And so cheaper homes, bigger homes, that's what happened, the entire time I was growing up in New York City. So for me, like, I was very fascinated in seeing, kind of the way that like a younger woman would look around and be like, duh, it's just a matter of time. Like, it's happening everywhere in New York City, which is like, for some reason, this is the one neighborhood in New York City that hasn't been touched by development of luxury condos. And so her daughter is very much kind of like, well, it is what it is, even ends up falling in love with the developer of the luxury building and having a very sexy romance, while her mother really sees the threat to her community as a real visceral threat to her survival. Now, look, the thing about them too is that I wanted for Eusebia to, like the mother figure, like I wanted her to have like a lot of trauma, in her life that prevents her in some ways from like seeing things for what they actually are. And so the threat gets bigger and bigger and bigger in her mind, so that there's a transformation that happens to Eusebia where like she herself becomes a monster and she herself puts her neighborhood at even greater risk than what this luxury building was putting at first. So I really wanted to explore and excavate what it means to be a person who's like willing to do everything it can to protect what you love, to the point where you were like risking it. So, yeah.
You read a section that had the tongues, the characters of the tongues who sort of serve like the fates in this story. Could you talk a little bit about incorporating elements of the fantastic into your work? And then I'd love to hear from Mary too, about how you worked in the tropes of fairy tales, even though yours is like it's a fresh retelling, but there's a lot of familiar tropes in there that were really subtly and lovely handled really in a lovely way. So could you both talk about that experience?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go quick. I was pretty obsessed, I think, as most of us probably who are, taking part in the festival and participating in events. I'm like a pretty big book nerd. And like I grew up reading, and I was an English major in college, and I, went to graduate school and we read a lot. And yeah, for me, I just really was always kind of obsessed with like Greek tragedies and Greek mythology. And I always thought that, the Greek chorus for me is just like so fun. Like the women were always so funny. And like, it was kind of like the mechanism that helped to give context to stories, right? To help you understand like the bigger stakes. And so I wanted to use these women. And in the book, there are interludes where like those are told from like first plural. So like the tongues are themselves telling you what happened from like, from the future. And so it's, for me, like, I just thought it would be really neat to like use these women who are super gossips, but also who like hold the history of the neighborhood and who, are just like really invested in preservation of their customs and of the neighborhood itself, and to have them have their own arc and their own transformation, because I think the women in my community are like that. They're like, real saucy and real, like they have bigger than life personalities and tend to be flawed in really delicious ways. And I wanted to explore that. But yeah, I would love to hear, Mary, like how you approach that. Like,
yeah, so I love that. I'm fascinated with the Greek chorus too. So I'm definitely gonna have to check that out and think about it in that context. I was with my book, I was really interested in the intersection between folklore and history. The book didn't originally, it's not just a Rapunzel, it's not really a Rapunzel retelling, it's like a origin story for the real person who would become known as the witch from Rapunzel. And so my original conceit for the book wasn't just about Rapunzel, it was about all these different folk tales. And we all know that folk tales change over time, and that every time a story gets told, the person who's telling it puts their perspective into it. And so what I wanted to do was kind of like portray a snapshot in history where a person interacted with some of the stories already existed, and that person told the stories and sort of transformed them, but also that person interacted with events that then, depending upon who told them, became the stories that we know today. And also the person, Cleyvis, the main character in the book, she's a storyteller too. And so not everything that she says is exactly fact, she tells stories as well. So I wanted to really explore the way that stories get told, the way that folk tales get told, how they could have interacted with history, and how skewed stories get when they are told from different perspectives. So that was sort of my inspiration for why I was interested in folk tales.
And I love the way you built the layers into your book as well. So there's the professor who is doing the translation, and she's got an interpretation. Then there's the main character, and you're gonna have to tell me how to pronounce her name properly.
Cleyvis.
Oh, Heloise?
It's the Middle High German ancestor for Heloise, so it's Heloise.
Oh, cool. And then she's like writing her biography. So there's like all these, and then we're reading it, so we're bringing our own interpretation. And I just love those layers of how like it really speaks to what you were just saying about how story is kind of interpreted. It's part the narrative of the teller and part the perception of the listener. And I thought that those layers really emphasized that, like that legacy of folklore nicely.
Mary, can you talk a little bit about like how you made the decision of like what you carried over? Like, I'm just curious about the ways in which we as writers get this opportunity to retell a story and kind of correct narratives that we find maybe are flawed. So I wonder if like that was part of some of your concerns as you approach the retelling, and like especially with all these layers.
Yeah. I can talk about like an example just to sort of give you an idea. So the biggest story that is in the book that is obviously the Rapunzel folktale. And when I set out to write from the perspective of the witch, I started asking questions about, okay, so witches are clearly vilified in folklore. The character of the witch in Rapunzel in earlier versions than Grimm, she's like a malicious fairy, and then before that she's an ogress. So she's vilified, and if the further you go back, like she becomes like non-human and monstrous, right? And I started asking myself questions like, well, why do women become known as witches? Like, who would be, if this were based on a real person's life, what would they actually be? What would women who were accused of being sorceresses or witches, what were they actually doing? And so then I changed the story to kind of like extrapolate this more realistic version of what that would be. So it's a midwife's apprentice who isn't quite Christian, who is different from the members in her community. You know, that combine that with poverty or women who were on the margins of society, those are the people who got accused of witchcraft. So that was kind of one of the decisions that I made. And I tried to do that whenever I retold the story. Like I would try to think about, you know, like who told it, the version that we know, and then like what if there was a true version, you know, what would that be like?
I love that. That's so rich.
You talked about Cleyvis when we were discussing in advance, was how joy plays into the stories as well, that these stories have a lot of heaviness. Mary's main character, Heloise, it's Heloise, is really kind of fighting for her place in society, and through circumstances is marginalized from the community, which is a real threat to your survival. I mean, their stakes are really dire for her. In my book, people are losing property and livelihoods. Same in Cleyvis's, that there's like this threat to your community and your sense of home. That's happens across all three stories. But you brought up this idea of joy and like how do we build joy into these stories? And I love that you brought that up. And so I wanted to hear from each of you about that too.
You want to start, Mary?
I can, yeah. I mean, you brought that up, and I was kind of thinking about it, and I was wondering, like, where does the joy come from in this story? And the answer that I came to was just like it's the joy of storytelling itself. Like in the book, you know, Heloise's mother Hedda tells her stories. Heloise turns around and tells stories to Mateus. You know, the whole novel is full of that, and I think that stories are a solace for Heloise and everything that she goes through, and that she finds joy in them for sure. What about you? Where I think part of it is like I love the way that your character was saying, you know, we have to do this, and we, you know, she seems to be taking joy in like this fabrication, right? But where does the joy come in your book?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, part of the reason why, for those who don't know this, my book is a journey and a labor of love over 15 years of my life, from like concept to publication. And, you know, a lot of the reason why I think the book failed early on is because I really didn't know how to tell the story of like Eusebia. Like the story of Luz came very easily because there were so many entry points for us. We had a lot in common. But Eusebia, you know, she just had a lot of rage and anger, and you know, I just, anytime that I tried to enter her story, I felt like this great weight. And you know, I often was very focused on like the rage and the anger, of like always being of service to people who take you for granted, and you know, having unresolved trauma in your life. And you know, I think it was really after I had children myself that I realized, you know, because before I had children, I was like, this must be the worst thing ever, having children. Like it must be so hard. They're so ungrateful. And I was just thinking about myself in the context of my relationship with my mom. But after I had children, you know, something clicked for me where it was like, it is so joyful having children. It is so beautiful. And you would do anything for your kids, including insane criminal things, right? And so all of a sudden I was thinking, like, the lens for me changed, where it was like, but everything comes from love. Like every decision she's making is really coming from this place of wanting to protect. And then I could hear her, and like, you know, Sevia manipulates people through food, which is something that women in my family have like PhDs in, like, you know, and I made her like a cook, and she's like, you know, some Michelin star type cook. And I just wanted to she's also really funny, and like the humor is not always like in what she says, but the way she looks at the world. And I think like bringing in that language of, you know, of just someone who just has always had resistance run through her blood, but has, you know, has lived in environments where she always felt she had to be subservient or in service to others. So, you know, I also feel like the most joyful part for me, I think, Mary, is very similar to yours, which is like, like telling stories is delicious, right? Like I keep using that word. Like and there are sad parts in this book. I mean, there are parts that I definitely cried, but I just remember like having so much fun myself. And like, you know, there's one scene where like Luz is trying to hide the fact that she's having this hot affair with a developer, and the developer just comes when she's with her mom. And it's like the whole thing is like a huge mess. And I was just laughing the whole time, like, oh my, I don't even know how to get them out of this jam, but I'm putting them in the jam. So, you know, I felt like I had a ton of joy as I was writing it. Rebekah, I'm curious for you, like, how do you feel like you found joy? Because this is, I mean, there's so much conflict in your book.
Well, I really tried to build some humor in and also kind of give the characters a break, if that makes sense, where I just felt like I'm just terrorizing these people and they're gonna need to have a little bit of fun in their lives. And so tried to take moments where take some pause. You know how it's like if you're watching a really intense action movie and you just sort of get worn out after a little while, you kind of need a break from the action. So then you have a scene at the beach or whatever that might be. So I tried to give some little moments of happiness and humor. And some of what I worked in for that was making friends. So when the character leaves to go work at the dam, he's making new friends. And so he's like hanging out with people. And so had some camaraderie scenes there, but also working in some of the music and literature of the day into like his experience. So he's going into a restaurant and he hears this song that people are familiar, you know, that is a famous song from the period. So that I tried to work it in that way, just like give them a little bit of downtime while the world is burning down. You also mentioned, Cleyvis, the process of writing a first book and the labor of love. And I thought that might be an interesting thing to talk about is just we've all published our first book and it's all a learning process. And so any takeaways from that you think would be interesting or helpful to anybody on here who is also interested in writing?
I can start. I mean, I'll tell you, I think sometimes people think that if you go to like a fancy MFA place like NYU, like somebody's ready to roll out a red carpet, and that's really not what happens when you're a writer. Like, I just think that writing inherently is really lonely and really difficult. And, you know, I just remember, you know, when we were in graduate school, it was kind of like life, you know, where for some people it happened super fast. And it seemed like they were handing out book contracts, you know, while people were still in school with us. And then for some of us, it just didn't happen that way. It took a really long time. And there was just so much rejection. And, you know, I remember like leaving my community, like, because I was working a full-time job and I just felt like it was kind of devastating. Just, you know, being told no and no and no and no, when like up until that point, I felt like I had been told, you're very talented, this is what you should be doing. And then it was like the market somehow didn't agree. And so, you know, I ended up leaving the writing community and I thought I would thrive on my own. Like, I thought I would be one of those people that would like leave and go work on the book on my own and then come back and be a huge success. But, you know, I actually feel like my skills atrophied when I was on my own. Like, I feel like I wasn't progressing as a writer, and I'm someone that's like super social. I do my best work with other people, especially, you know, in workshops. And, you know, I had to come back, right? So that's what happened to me 4 years ago. I came back into the writing community. It was humbling because I just didn't want to give up on this book. I felt like I knew the book, I wasn't pulling it off, but the idea itself was really compelling. And so, you know, and I had already put another book away. So I was like, I'm not going to like abandon the story too. So, you know, I'm really grateful for that now, because when I came back and I was like, well, I'm just going to take more workshops and I'm just going to go back into writing workshops and, you know, like going to take classes with teachers and then being in an environment with other emerging writers where we're helping each other. And that like worked for me a lot. I mean, it was still slow. I mean, it was still 3 more years after that I sold the book. But I think, you know, leaving the community and coming back for me was like a really important and painful lesson about what I need in order to thrive as a writer. Mary, any takeaways from your journey as a writer to your first book?
Yeah, I mean, so mine was 8 years, but in the other years before that, there were other like failed books that I still have, you know, in a file and in a drawer somewhere, that I'm not sure I'll come back to. I might, but so this one took 8 years to write, and yeah, I mean, I don't know if I want to talk about the process, because it was really discouraging. You know, querying is a really hard thing, and finding an agent. I had another agent for a different book years ago, and that one went out on submission, and then it ultimately didn't sell, even though it won an award as a, you know, but so there was a really long and like roller coastery journey, where it would be really big ups and really big downs, and that's sort of my takeaway of the publishing process too. Like, it's so exciting and so wonderful to have, you know, this story that you made up and these characters that lived in your head for so long, to have them like make their way out into the world and become something for other people, right? Like, to become real for other people. That's so rewarding. But it is also just like that roller coaster ride of, you know, are you going to get a book deal or aren't you? Like, it like continues after you after publication as well. You know, it's like it just becomes other questions that you have. So it's been a pretty it's been a roller coaster ride. It's been wonderful, and I don't know. I wonder if it kind of evens out a little bit more after you do your first book. Maybe so.
I guess we'll find out.
Rebekah, what are your lessons? I need all the help I can get for the next book. So
I think the hardest part for me was learning how to edit myself. And I had trained myself in graduate school to be really good at generating content. And then you workshop it, and then you keep writing, and you know, and so I never went back and did a lot of revision. And to try to learn how to revise at 300 pages was just like finding continuity problems where I'm like, oh, I changed this thing and it has this like whole domino effect. So now I'm obsessively rereading the whole thing. And I opted to go with a small press, so I didn't have the layers of like copy editors and proofreaders that you might have had at a larger press. So a lot of that was on me, like to learn that and work with, you know, just one editor on getting all of that squared away. And it was a great process, but it was just like way out of my comfort zone as somebody who's never really been an editor to other people either. And so I had to learn this completely new skill on my own. Also feeling the pressure of like, oh, everybody's gonna read this, and what if I screw it up? So that was I think now I'm better at it. I still wish I could have taken another pass at editing it, but I mean, that was kind of the biggest struggle for me, was learning how to revise and having to make some tough decisions myself, and learning to listen to myself and what I thought it needed, and being able to advocate for that. I hadn't ever really had to do that in this kind of a scenario before, so that was fascinating to me. So we are at the hour. Are there any questions from the attendees? Anybody want to know anything?
There is one in there. It's how do you know when it's done? That is the question.
Still be tinkering with it if someone hadn't like wrestled it out of my hands and said we have to go to press.
You know, there's this really great podcast that's with Disha Filia and Donnie Walton. It's called Ursa Fiction. You can find that in any. And a few episodes ago, they had this Ask Me Anything session, and they were talking about revision, and I found that like really inspiring to hear these two award-winning writers talking about how difficult it always is to revise your own work, and how like it never gets easier. And they got to this point where they were asking each other like, when do you know it's done? And they were talking about how being done is really more of a feeling, and more often than not, and I'm just gonna like, you know, paraphrase what Disha Filia said. She said, you know, sometimes it's like the desire to move on to working on something else. So like one of the things we have to do, because we're all obsessives, and the fact is that the work is never done. Like in my perspective, we're all like, if you're committed to reading and writing and like going to workshop and working on a next project that is just a little bit beyond your skill set, like you're always gonna be a better writer, I think, over time. And so, you know, what I found with Neruda on the Park was that, oh, I'm such a better writer today, right, than I was 6 months ago. And that kept happening to me. So I would rewrite all the scenes. I would rewrite them and they would be better, right? But at one point I was like, I think I want to write another book. I don't want to keep working on this book. And I was working on like a collection of short stories. And I was, so like, I think having other projects that you're working on, and having a desire to like move forward, you know, do your best by this story and then like move on to the next story and do your best by that story. I think that's important. And I really took a lot of like, I love that when Disha said that. I was like, that sounds like a good way to like think about it.
Yeah, I'll just chime in. It's kind of a short answer because I really believe that like it's never really done, right? So the answer for me is when your editor says it's time to go to copy editing, that's when it's done for me, and that's the only time. So
Other questions for us?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Really?
Yes.
Yes. Hi, Eric.
Hey, man. How are you? Rebekah?
Yeah. Is your sound? I can hear you. Can you hear us?
I can hear you. I'm not really good at that stuff. I got your like thing on Facebook and I'm just gonna, it's been really interesting and fun, and I do want to read the book. And I live right by the Queen Central Library, and I can order that book.
Yeah, I think
So I'll do
all
that.
3 books are available to purchase online. I don't know if mine would be in the New York Public Library system. Cleyvis and Mary's probably are.
I know what I'm doing.
I'm going to drop,
All right.
before we sign off, I'm going to drop links in the chat for where to find more
Okay,
information
fair
about
enough.
the books.
Sure.
Cool.
Thank you.
So
Thank you for the
that I was just
support.
gonna say really quickly, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
It's been really fun to listen to you, all of you. And I am living in a gentrifying, weird neighborhood in New York. And I also remember like this one crazy trip I took out to my friend Nathan. And it was just like, we're in Bellingham, and we just got up and was like, what are we gonna do? Let's just drive to Grand Coulee. And we did it. And it was like a 19-hour caffeinated road trip. And we, you know, we got there, and then we had to go home before the laser show started. Because they had a laser show, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And then like the other thing about that was really cool out there, I don't know if you, so like there's this couple that made these whirligigs out there, and they have a whirligig park around it. Anyway, the interesting thing about that was always that was I don't know, it's just like this weird wind-powered thing that is around like this giant water-powered dam.
Cool.
It's a very special art piece in my
Maybe that's my second book.
I think that's a sign.
Look it up.
Rebekah, you gotta look it up.
Whatever. And yeah, it was just like, it was nice, and I intend to get your book. I looked for it a few times. I guess I'll just have to buy it another way.
I'll drop the info in the chat right now.
Yeah, sometimes it's better to order online because I know there's a few bookstores by me that like might not have it. Thank you, Rebekah. Thank you for that.
I can make them buy all your books.
Well, that would be great, Eric. We would really appreciate it.
Yeah, and the best way to support writers and publishers is to buy books or request books from the library. So if you care about people continuing to be able to publish, that's the best way to support these endeavors.
All right, well.
thank you everybody for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here.
This is so great.
Hey, man. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, it was really nice.
Great. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Rebekah, for pulling us together. This was awesome.
You bet.
Bye.
All right, I'll get that part of it done. All right. Later on. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks.